When you picture the world of the Old Testament, what do you see? Prophets shouting from mountaintops, seas splitting in half, fire falling from heaven, 40 years of wandering through a wilderness that never seems to end. We tend to imagine these people living in a kind of permanent state of spiritual crisis, as if every waking moment was a plague, a battle, or a burning bush. Visual, the camera settles on the fire, shadows of people sitting close together. But here's a question we almost never ask. What did they do when the sun went down? When the tents were pitched, the animals were fed, the bread was baked, and the kids were bored out of their minds? They did what human beings have always done. They played games. And this isn't speculation. We're not guessing. We have the boards, we have the pieces, we have the dice, and in some cases we even have the written rules pressed into clay thousands of years ago. Today we're going to sit down at the game tables of the biblical world, from Abraham's hometown to Pharaoh's court to the hills of Canaan, because the people who walked through these pages weren't just figures in a sacred drama. They were human beings, and human beings love to play. Let's start at the beginning, and I mean the asterisk beginning around 2600 BC in the city of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq. In the 1920s, an archaeologist named Leonard Woolley was excavating the royal tombs of Ur when he pulled this out of the ground. A game board, 20 squares arranged in 2 blocks connected by a bridge, inlaid with shell, red limestone and lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone that ancient kings prized above almost anything. This is the royal game of Ur, and it is functionally the world's oldest playable board game. Here's how it works. It's a race, 2 players each with a set of pieces. You roll dice, but not the cubes we use today. These were tetrahedral, 4-sided pyramids with certain corners marked. You'd throw them and count the marked points that landed up. That number is how far you move. You race your pieces from your starting rosette across the board and off the finish line. First to get all your pieces home wins. And there's a nasty little twist. If you land on a square occupied by your opponent's piece, you knock it right off the board. It has to start over. Anyone who has ever played a race and capture game recognizes this instantly. The frustration is 4,500 years old. Now, where does this fit in the biblical story? This is the world of Abraham. Genesis 11:31 tells us that Abraham at that point came from Ur of the Chaldees, this city. And while dating the patriarchs is genuinely debated, the royal game of Ur was being played in this exact city for centuries. It was the entertainment of the culture Abraham was born into. So picture it, before the call to leave everything behind, before go from your country and your kindred, Abraham was, at some point, a boy. And this is the game that boy would have played, on a board like this one with dice like these. And here's where it gets interesting theologically. Look at these rosettes, the flower shapes marked on the special squares. In Mesopotamian religion, the rosette was a sacred symbol associated with the goddess Inanna or Ishtar. These weren't just decorative. Landing on them was lucky. They were, in a sense, little gateways to the favor of the gods. And that tells you something about the world Abraham came out of. It was a world saturated with divinity, where the cosmos itself was populated by gods you had to appease, read, and gamble with, where the roll of a die might carry a message from the heavens. Against that backdrop, the God who calls Abraham does something radically different. He doesn't require you to read the entrails, cast the dice, or land on the right rosette. He speaks. A God who makes a covenant with words and keeps it, rather than a God you have to negotiate with by chance. One last thing, and it's remarkable. We don't just guess how this game was played. In 1980s, a curator at the British Museum named Irving Finkel translated a Babylonian clay tablet from 177 BC, written by a scribe named Itty-Marduk Balatu, that lays out the rules. Think about that. We have the written instruction manual for a game that Abraham's family played. It's the oldest surviving set of game rules on Earth, and we can still play it today. Now we travel west, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, and we meet the most popular board game of the ancient world. Senet. 30 squares laid out in 3 rows of 10. Each player has a set of pawns, and once again it's a race. You move your pieces along the board following a boustrophedon path. That's a fancy word meaning it snakes back and forth like an ox plowing a field. But Senet is meaner than the game of Ur. Certain squares are traps. Land on the wrong one and you lose a turn, get sent backward, or get bumped by an opponent. Some squares are safe havens. Some are hazards you have to pass through, like the waters of chaos near the end, where a bad throw could send you tumbling back. And notice, no dice. To determine your move, you threw sticks, flat on one side, curved on the other. You toss them and count how many landed flat side up. Hold that detail. We'll come back to it because it matters more than you'd think. Where does this fit? This is the world of Joseph, and later of Moses. Joseph rises to power in Egypt somewhere around 1900 to 1700 BC in the account of Genesis 37 through 50, and that period is the golden age of Senate. It was asterisk everywhere, in the palace and in the mud brick house. Kings played it, servants played it. When they opened Tutankhamun's tomb, they found multiple Senate sets buried with him, because by that point the game had taken on a deeper meaning. And here's the fascinating turn. Over the centuries, Senate stopped being just a game. The Egyptians began to see the board as a map of the afterlife. The 30 squares became the journey of the soul through the underworld. The traps and hazards became the trials the dead had to survive. To win at Senate was to symbolically pass safely into eternity, to be justified before the gods of the dead. There are versions of the Book of the Dead that literally show the deceased playing Senate against an invisible opponent, playing for their soul. Now Moses, Exodus 2:10 tells us Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household. He grew up as an Egyptian prince, which means almost without question Moses learned to play Senate. The man who would later confront Pharaoh probably once sat across a Senate board from Egyptian nobility. And think about the collision of worldviews here. Senate became a game about asterisk earning your way through death by surviving the right squares, but the faith Moses would carry to Israel rejected that entire Egyptian death cult framework. Israel's God is the God of the living. The transition Israel had to make out of Egypt, out of that whole religious universe, is mirrored in miniature right here on this board. And those throwing sticks I told you to remember, in the ancient Near East, tossing sticks or bones to determine an outcome was called casting asterisk lots, in Hebrew asterisk goral asterisk. Proverbs 16:33 says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." The Egyptian threw the sticks to move his pawn toward paradise, trusting in chance and the gods of the dead. Israel took that same mechanism, the cast lot, and said, the outcome isn't chance at all, it's the Lord. We're going to come all the way back to that idea at the end. Hold on to it. Our next game has one of the best names in all of archaeology. Officially, scholars call it 58 holes, but everyone else calls it by its nickname. Hounds and Jackals. Here's why. This game came with 10 little pegs. 5 of them are carved with the heads of hounds, dogs. The other 5 are carved with the heads of jackals. 2 players, 1 team each. The board has 58 holes drilled into it, arranged in 2 curving parallel tracks, 1 for each player, often with little bridges or connecting marks between certain holes. You move your pegs up the track hole by hole, and the throw of sticks or knucklebones tells you how far to advance. First to get your pegs to the top wins. It's a race game again, but this one is portable asterisk. The pegs stick into the holes, so you could pick the whole thing up mid-game and move to a different tent without losing your place. It was the ancient equivalent of a travel edition. Where does it fit? Hounds and Jackals shows up from Middle Kingdom Egypt, around 2000 BC, and spreads across the ancient Near East through the Late Bronze Age, down to about 1200 BC. Which puts it squarely in Canaan during the era of the conquest and the judges. And this isn't theoretical. Archaeologists have dug these boards out of the ground at Megiddo, at Beit Shean, at Tel El Farah. These are real biblical cities. Beit Shean is where the Philistines hung the bodies of Saul and his sons on the city wall, in 1 Samuel 31. Megiddo is the site whose name gives us the word Armageddon. People in these cities, the Canaanites the Israelites lived among, were playing hounds and jackals. And I love the symbolism buried in this game. Think about the 2 animals. The hound, domesticated, loyal, a companion, a hunter that serves its master, and the jackal, wild, a scavenger, an animal that haunts ruins and picks at the dead. In Israelite categories, an unclean creature. Jackals appear all over the Old Testament, and always as an image of desolation and abandonment. Isaiah 13:22, jackals will howl in the ruined palaces of Babylon. Jeremiah 9:11, Jerusalem will become a lair of jackals. Lamentations 5:18, jackals prowl over the ruined Temple Mount. So this children's game is, in a quiet way, a picture of the great biblical tension, order against chaos, the domestic against the wild, civilization against desolation, hounds against jackals racing up the same board. Now for a game you might actually have in your house right now, and it may be older than all the rest. Mancala. Mancala isn't really one game. It's a whole family of games, hundreds of variations played across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. But they all share the same beautiful, simple mechanism. You have rows of pits. Each pit is filled with a handful of seeds or stones or shells. On your turn, you scoop up all the seeds from one pit and sow them, dropping one seed into each following pit as you go around the board. Depending on where your last seed lands, you might capture your opponent's seeds. Whoever gathers the most wins. It's a game of counting and planting and harvesting, and you don't need dice or sticks or expensive lapis lazuli. You need some pits in the ground and a handful of seeds, which is exactly why it's so hard to date. You see, the boards were often just holes scratched into rock or scooped into the dirt. You can still find rows of pits worn into the stone of ancient sites and temple courtyards, though we can't always be sure which ones were game boards and which were something else. The oldest solid physical evidence comes from Aksumite Ethiopia, around the 6th century AD, with earlier hints from Egypt. But the game's sheer simplicity suggests it's far older than any board we can put a firm date on. This may be a game older than writing itself. And the metaphor here is almost too perfect. Mancala is a game about asterisk sowing asterisk, about dropping seed into the earth one at a time and reaping a harvest from where you plant it. And the Old Testament is asterisk drenched in sowing imagery, because it was written by and for an agrarian people who lived and died by the harvest. Hosea 10:12, sow for yourselves righteousness, reap steadfast love. Hosea 8:7, one of the most haunting lines in the prophets, they sow the wind and they shall reap the whirlwind. Job, the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, over and over, life itself is described as sowing and reaping. And centuries before Jesus tells the parable of the sower in Matthew 13, ordinary people were sitting in the dirt, sowing seeds into little pits, playing out that same rhythm as a game. Mancala is the game of the world the prophets actually lived in, the world of the field, the seed, and the harvest. Which brings us to the last one, and this one is different, because it's the game that wasn't a game. Casting lots. Throughout the ancient world, people used these astragali, sheep or goat ankle bones. They have 4 irregular flat sides, and when you throw them, they land differently each time. They were used for gambling, for fortune-telling, and for games all over the Near East. They are quite literally the ancestor of modern dice. But in Israel, this same object became something sacred. Look at how often the Old Testament turns to the lot for its most important decisions. Numbers 26, the promised land itself is divided among the tribes by casting lots. Joshua 7, when someone has stolen what was devoted to destruction at Jericho, the guilty man, Achan, is identified by casting lots, narrowing down tribe by tribe, clan by clan, until the bone falls on him. 1 Samuel 10, Israel's very first king, Saul, is selected by lot in front of the whole nation. 1 Chronicles 24, the priests are assigned their rotations of temple service by lot. Now stop and think about what's actually happening here. A pagan in Ur or Egypt would throw these same bones to divine the will of the gods, to gamble, to read fate, to manipulate the divine. The exact same object, the exact same throw. But Israel picks it up and makes a stunning claim about it. Remember Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. To the Israelite there was no such thing as chance. When the bone tumbled and came to rest, it wasn't luck, and it wasn't a message you had to decode from a distant, capricious God. It was the direct decision of the living God who was already in covenant with them. So the same knucklebone that a Philistine used to gamble away his wages, an Israelite priest used to discern the will of Yahweh, same object, completely different universe. At the very heart of Israel's worship sat this idea. The high priest wore a breastplate, and inside it were the Urim and Thummim, objects we don't fully understand, but which functioned as a kind of sacred lot to seek God's guidance. The mechanism the whole ancient world used to gamble was placed over the heart of the priest, right against the presence of God. That's the great reversal. Chance redeemed, the dice sanctified. What everyone else used to grasp at fate, Israel used to listen for the voice of the one who holds it. So here's what all of this leaves us with. The people of the Old Testament were human asterisk, fully, ordinarily human. They worried about the harvest and argued with their neighbors and got bored on long evenings. And then they pulled out a board, threw the sticks, and tried to knock their brother's peace back to the start, probably while laughing, probably while cheating a little. We meet them in scripture at the mountaintop and the burning bush, but they lived most of their lives in the ordinary hours in between, and in those hours they played. The royal game of Ur went silent for 1500 years. Nobody played it, nobody remembered how. The rules were buried in a language no living person spoke, until someone dug up a board and then a tablet and slowly, patiently taught the world to play again. Which makes you wonder, what else is still down there? What other games, what other pieces of these ordinary human lives are still waiting under the sand, waiting for someone to pick them up and press play? So here's my challenge to you. Go dust off a board game. Round up your family or your friends or your bored kids and play something. Because when you do, you're not just killing an evening. You're continuing a tradition older than the pyramids.